Welcome to Barn Connect, a podcast about creativity and community. I'm Jen Hemmingson.
And I'm Abby Wyatt.
And today we've got a really cool conversation with best-selling author Susan Wiggs, who will be teaching a fiction writing masterclass with Elizabeth George in the Writer's Studio next month. So pretty awesome.
Yeah, and we're very excited to have them both in the building at the same time. That's what, over 150 books authored total between the two of them?
Yeah, Susan said she stopped counting at 50. And Elizabeth has written more than 80, including the Inspector Lindley mystery series. And Elizabeth's books are historical and contemporary romance. And what's fun is they're friends in real life. So
it's really going to be fun.
Yeah, they've taught together for a long time, which we'll hear about in the pod.
Yeah. So let's go talk to Susan.
Let's talk to Susan. Okay, awesome. Okay, well, can I have you say your first and last name?
Susan Wiggs.
Welcome, Susan. It's great to have you here. So in September, you're going to be teaching a fiction writing masterclass with Elizabeth George, and that's going to be a day-long event. It's going to be like 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You're going to hunker down and really get inspired. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that day is going to look and feel like?
Yes, it's going to be a dynamic, hands-on, prompt-driven workshop for writers at any level. And you don't need to have a work in progress, although that would be helpful.
Okay.
We can help you with just your idea or bring your work in progress and be prepared to go home just fired up to really tackle it, roll up your sleeves and tackle it. I'm very excited for you.
That sounds great. Tell us a little bit about your background. What do you do?
Oh, I'm a longtime Bainbridge Islander, and what I do is I sit around all day and make stuff up. I'm a fiction writer. Been a fiction writer all my life, literally all my life. Even before I could write, I would scribble on paper and make pictures and dictate to my mother.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Wow.
And she saved some of them. And I remember I was like 3 years old saying, write this down.
Oh, wow.
So I was making stories. I had that third grade teacher that I wish everybody would have in their life who just, I told her I wanted to be a book writer. And she said, well, then you should be writing books. And I would she gave me the stapler and the tape and, all the materials. And every time I would make a book, she would read it to the class.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
That's amazing.
That's the teacher you need for your kids, right?
Yeah.
And so, I never studied it as a subject in college. I knew that I had a very commercial voice. And so I decided, to kind of keep it under wraps, because I think one of the things that I've learned over the years is protect your voice as a writer. Don't be stubborn about it. Be open to change and instruction and developing it and everything, but know how you sound and what kind of storyteller you are. The class that we're offering coming in September is going to definitely be focused on the writer, prompt driven. We want to demystify this mysterious process, because one thing that I remember when I was an aspiring writer, the first 26 years of my life. I was 26 when I sold my first book. Anyway, the first 26 years of my life, I just thought writers were, they lived in these ateliers somewhere and were very, ethereal and unapproachable. And I didn't know very much about their process or the publishing process. And so we kind of want to demystify the mysterious aspects of the process and offer real world answers to anybody's questions and kind of, humanize it and put a face to the way a writing career can, first a novel can develop and a writing career can progress.
Oh, what a great opportunity.
Yeah, all in one day.
That's a full day. Yeah.
It's going to be a busy day.
So you published your first book in 1987, is that
yes,
right?
I did.
And you stopped counting at 50, is that right?
I did. Well, if you think about it, because I was a commercial paperback writer, paperback originals, mostly romance novels, other kinds of genre novels. And so one way to create a career around that is to publish frequently.
Okay.
So I published a book or two every year since then.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
If you could go back and tell that newly published author something, what advice would you have for her?
That's a good question. I think create or give myself more trust in my own instincts. There were a couple of times when it's so easy to get swayed by someone else's advice or someone else's idea. And so I think that's probably what I would say is, trust my gut more. And I did early in my career, I had a couple of missteps where I didn't find the right fit for a literary agent.
Oh.
And so I had to make a change there. And once I got on track with the right literary agent, it kind of changed everything for me. And so that's a key relationship in publishing. So
that must be tough, because as a new writer, you're probably looking for some validation, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the agent that I worked with prior to my current agent was fine, but not fine for me, So you have to make some business decisions. But because it's a creative art, it feels very fraught and, very crucial. And you don't want to make a mistake, but you got
to be out there a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Talk a little bit about your process, would you?
Yeah. I am like a magpie, grabbing like little shiny bits and bobs from wherever I see them. I have another book that definitely built itself around all these little bits and pieces. It's called Wayward Girls. It'll be out in June 2025. And it started because I was on a kind of a nostalgia tour of this little small town where I was born in upstate New York, kind of near Buffalo. And I was with my brother. And sadly, he had a terminal diagnosis. And so he and his wife and my husband and me, we were doing like this nostalgia tour just to kind of, do a full circle with John. And I had not really a recovered memory, but a memory of him as an altar boy in our church because we went to see the church. And I said, oh, remember that time your sleeve caught on fire because they had these coals in the thurible and he was the thurifer. Anyway, big, long story, but it just sort of evolves like that. And then I have an idea. I have like a central idea. And everybody comes to their novel ideas in all sorts of ways. And so there's not really any set path, but mine usually has like you have a tuning fork inside you and something resonates. And sometimes it's complete garbage. Sometimes it's like, oh, I must have eaten something bad. But other times it sticks around. And this was one of those ideas that kind of stuck around with me for a while. And then I usually sit and map out the story for myself.
Okay.
I do everything by hand. I'm not fond of sitting at a computer.
Okay.
So I write everything in longhand in very nice notebooks. So I feel very soigné. And I have a writer's group and sometimes I'll, talk about it with them and brainstorm. I have a really creative husband. And so sometimes I'll talk to him about ideas that I have and probably bore people to death. And eventually I'll get around to writing something. Some people call it an outline. Some people call it a synopsis. And that's something as a person with an agent and a publisher, I'll just pitch it to them, to my agent, and she'll weigh in on the idea and then pitch it to my publisher and then I go write the book.
Okay.
So and I say I go write to the book like it's not
nothing.
A year of blood, sweat, and tears. But and then I also write my first draft in longhand.
Oh, you do?
I do.
Oh, wow.
And my books, God, the last one I wrote was 130,000 words. So it was a lot.
Goodness. Yeah.
And then it used to be such a chore to type it up, but now I just read it I just dictate it.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you like about longhand? How is it different for you?
It feels more concrete and crafty to me. I'm definitely less distracted because if you think about it, we were just talking earlier about all the tabs open on your computer. And no matter how much you think you have minimized your distractions and your notifications and everything, something's always going to come through. And when you're just all by yourself with your blank page and your pen, there's something that's a little more disciplined because I'm a very distractible person.
Okay.
I think a lot of us are.
Yeah.
And
you can't flip your notebook and turn to Amazon.
Exactly. Exactly. And I do, because I know I'm distractible, I always have a pad of Post-it notes. And if something is distracting me, I scribble it on the Post-it note and say, I'll come back to you.
Okay.
And it's remarkable how little I actually do come back to the things that seemed so crucial.
Oh my gosh.
That's a really good exercise for, I think, anybody who's at work, because it's way too easy to say, oh, I meant to get that book, or, oh, I need to add this to my cart somewhere,
all these fleeting thoughts.
Or put this on my calendar, or, make a call. And so rather than stopping myself to do it, I just scribble it down on Post-it, and I'll go back and say, I didn't really need to do that. And I'm glad I didn't interrupt myself in order to do that.
Yeah.
So that's just a little training technique that I do. And I write probably, when I'm writing my first draft, I probably write between 1,000 and 2,000 words a day.
Okay.
I try not to score myself too much, but I do try to be consistent.
Okay.
And that might take 3 hours, and it might take 8 hours.
Did you kind of come to that by trial and error, or how did you?
It's weird. I always did it.
Okay.
And I think I started it because when I first started writing really seriously, to sit down and write a novel, I was in graduate school, and my dad had bought me a typewriter to take to graduate school, and I hated typing so much. And so I thought, well, I'll write everything in my handwriting and only type it up.
Okay.
Hopefully just one time, because it's just death to probably very few of our listeners know the era of the typewriter. But if you made a mistake that was uncorrectable on the page, you had to retype the whole page.
Yeah, that is torture.
Awful. And so I think I trained myself, and it just feels more crafty to me too, like knitting a book.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. So now you're teaching this workshop with Elizabeth George.
Yes.
And you are friends in real life.
We are. And we met in such a writerly environment. There was, I think it was started back in the 90s. There was a really well-regarded writers retreat and conference in Maui, on the island of Maui. And it was the week before Labor Day and then through Labor Day every year. And they got quite a reputation for being a good training ground for writers and of all genres and all. And so they decided to add a retreat to the conference. And so they needed a group of writers who could teach and were willing to, sit in a hotel conference room for 5 days with other writers and be sort of the mentor to probably, I think it was like 10 people that were in each section. And Elizabeth and I were two of the first instructors to step up and do that. And so we planned some things together, and then we just kind of bonded over that and stayed friends. She moved to Whidbey Island a number of years ago, and so we would always, hang out. And now she lives in Seattle, she and her husband. And so we see each other socially now, and go to events together. And there was a real dry spell for everybody, I think, during COVID. Mm-hmm. And nobody saw anybody. Nobody had any fun. We did nothing. And it's weird to be a writer and complain about COVID, because the whole world had to be writers. We had to be alone in a room. Nobody could see us. But for some reason, it just felt very fraught. We had, all our events were canceled. All of our book tours whatever. And so this is kind of our coming out together. I'm so pleased that you guys reached out to us because we both teach. She was a high school English teacher. I was a 5th grade math teacher. And we both really enjoy teaching. And so this is a really fun opportunity. And between the two of us, we probably have 100 years experience and 100 books published. And so there's probably plenty to learn. Because I remember when I was an emerging writer, I was very shy. And I didn't want to approach, successful published writers. I was very intimidated by that whole process. And so we kind of we want to do the opposite. We want to kind of, show ourselves, warts and all to a room full of writers. And we're going to, but it's going to be for writers at all levels because I still take workshops and go to workshops when I can. And there's always something to learn.
Yeah.
It's kind of like playing pickleball on Baber's Island. You can always get better at it, right?
Yeah. Or learn a hack or something to try.
Yes, always.
Yeah.
And I think every writer is convinced that another writer has the secret and they're just not telling us.
Who is that, by the way?
Right? And then I think, if there really was a secret, don't you think that, Stephen King and Nora Roberts and Ann Tyler would have figured it out and told us about it? But Elizabeth George actually has worked with this concept, and she has published 2 books that we're probably going to draw from in the masterclass. One was called Write Away, and it was her book on the practice of writing. And then her other one is called Mastering the Process.
Great.
And I have a book on writing that is not written, but it's going to be awesome when I finally sit down to do it.
So you have the secret. You're hoarding it.
Exactly.
Well, this is so exciting. And you were talking about how you love teaching writers. Talk a little bit more about that.
I do. One of the most pleasurable things about teaching writers is that they are all A students. I bet everybody who signs up to be a writer and wants to be a writer was that kid that did all her homework and spelled everything right and punctuated everything right and was front and center. I want to sit in the front. I want to learn from you. Writers have hungry minds. And I was aware of this even when I opted to teach math, but a room full of writers is a really dynamic, energetic, there's a kind of energy in a room full of writers that is really, it's just a joy to be among. And some of the podcasts, I started listening to podcasts a few years ago when they started getting popular. And some of my favorites have to do with writers' rooms. And I'm not a screenwriter, but series and screenplays and things like that have not just usually have more than one writer. They'll have, a staff of writers, and they call it the writer's room. And I love the podcasts that let you be a fly on the wall, and they talk about, they'll analyze an episode and talk about who did what and why they made these choices and things like that. And I just love the energy of that.
That's really cool.
And so a novelist does not collaborate, but we sure do talk about our ideas and we workshop our ideas. And so I'm hopeful that this room that we create in September, assuming we get enough people signing up, is going to be that kind of energetic, fun place to be for a day.
That's really great. I mean, to facilitate that kind of a room, it seems like there's nobody who's better positioned than the two of you, having walked through it, having taught it, having that experience of being that new writer who needs to protect her voice, and then, the established author.
We love to talk shop. We do. That's like our favorite thing. So I know writers talk about writing like other people talk about sex. It's just, yes. It's just always top of mind. Yeah. So, so I want people to know, listeners to know, if you're brand new and you're just getting started and maybe you barely even have anything to put on paper, you'll still benefit from this class. Or if you're a seasoned professional, there will be takeaways for you as well.
So
I hope.
Yeah.
That's
come and get some ideas and hear from people. And are there still challenging days for you as a writer?
Always. Yes, always. And yeah, there are. And I wish there was a remedy, but sometimes there's just not. There's just not. Sometimes all I have is, bottled up somewhere and I can't see my way free of it. And that's actually something we could talk about in the class. There are techniques you can do. Some people say get up, take a walk. Some people say go read something, go, pull weeds in the garden, something. And so ways to take the stopper out of the bottle. But it's never not going to happen. If somebody is just taking dictation from God for, 100,000 words, they don't really need us, do they?
So how important, writing is such a solitary activity. How important is it to have a community of writers?
It's intermittently important.
Okay.
You don't want to do too much because I have a writers group that I adore, but we're a lot of work for each other. We read each other's material, and we're very generous with our brainstorming and everything. But we're also very respectful of each other's time and their deadlines and schedules. There is some kind of creative energy that happens when writers get together. But as you mentioned, you can't write a book by committee.
Right.
Ultimately, it boils down to you alone in a room. I do know writers who like to write in a cafe or at the library or something like that, but ultimately it's just you and the story. And so you do have to be protective of your own time. I think one complaint that I hear from so many writers is I have this great idea for a book, but I have no time. I have kids. I have a job. I've got obligations. I've got elderly parents.
Yeah.
I have all of the above.
Yeah.
And I don't have an answer. When I wrote my first early books, I was a young mom with a toddler and a full-time teacher.
Oh,
and I just would sit down at 9:00 at night to write.
Just do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, no TV. Fortunately, there was no internet. I wonder sometimes if I would get anything done if I had the internet.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So I think, I can't remember who said this to me. Probably a teacher said, you make time for what's important to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Seems like there are so many people who get kind of stuck in that wanting to write phase.
Yes. Yeah. And how do you make the leap from you want to write? Because everybody has stories.
Yeah.
Your next door neighbor,
Yeah.
Somebody that you run into at a school meeting or something like that. Everybody has stories, and we're storytellers. And some of us are darn good at it until we say, well, you ought to sit down and write that story.
Then all of a sudden.
Yep. The blocks come up. And so, and we could talk about that in class too. How do you make the transition from this boiling, roiling, amazing, golden orb of an idea that's inside of us to actually sitting down and getting the story on paper?
Yeah.
And one thing you have to learn to accept is that the story in your head, anything you write will never be as glorious as the story in your head.
Yeah.
But you have to remind yourself that what you do get, the story that does come out of you is going to make you happy and readers happy in a whole new way. But it's just never going to be that perfect, flawless piece of work that you've been carrying around. You have to get over it. I know. Wouldn't it be great if the exact vision in your head could just automatically, maybe AI will do that for us.
No.
I have a feeling not.
No. Well, and then you have this entirely different animal, which is the business of writing, right? Getting your agent, getting your publisher, and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Like, was that a big learning curve for you? How did that go?
Huge.
Yeah.
Huge.
Yeah.
And I'm still learning. I've on my 50-somethingth book, and I just learned about how they kern the print on the page in order to price the book at a certain price, and this whole process. And I just took it all for granted, but now, especially now that, prices have gone up so much, there's a big difference. You don't want your book to have to cost $40.
Sure.
Your hardcover book. So,
Sure.
there are little things like that. And then there are the big things like, how do I get an agent? What does an agent look like? How do they work? That kind of thing. And how does the agent match you up with a publisher, and what does that look like? And so I'm hoping that on the 14th of September, when we do there will be time at the end of the day for Q&A, because that's when it becomes their workshop.
Yeah.
All their questions answered. I always try to say when I'm on a podcast or in a class or something, I always try to say, don't pay anybody a fee to read your work, a reading fee or a processing fee or something like that. Agents don't work that way. They work on commission, and their commission comes from the sales that they make on your behalf. Now that's in today's world, you call that trad publishing, traditional publishing.
Yeah.
There's independent publishing, and that's a different setup. And I'm not I don't really have much knowledge in that. So if somebody wants to go indie publishing that route, they should definitely learn that side of the business.
Yeah.
And not from me.
But even to go and learn more about traditional publishing to see if it's for you.
Yes.
To explore that as an idea, because it is difficult. That's a big hill to climb, but
it is.
Yeah.
It is. And indie publishing to me seems like you do all the work and you get to keep all the money.
You have so much more creative control, I think.
Right. You do. On the other hand, I don't want control over my cover art and my kerning and my editorial, just all of that. My marketing, no, thank you. I'm not a marketer. And so I would rather, for me, the better fit is traditional publishing. But there are people who have had crazy success being indie publishers. And so.
Well, and how great that it's an option now.
That
people can make a choice.
It definitely is.
Yeah. What do you tell people when they say, oh, I could never write, or I'm not creative, or?
I tell them what I just said. Everybody's a storyteller. Everybody's, your neighbor's sitting on her porch. Start asking her, well, so how'd you meet your husband? Everybody has a story. And so I think when people say I could never write, I think they're thinking about their inner perfectionism is coming through. And sometimes it's just a matter of getting the words flowing and getting the ideas down on paper. Yeah. And a lot of that is perspiration, not inspiration.
Just get those 2,000 words no matter what. Yeah. Well, this has been a real treat. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any final words for?
I am looking forward to hearing from lots of people about this workshop. I hope that it goes. I hope that we find a good group. And I also wanted to add one more postscript. People who need encouragement in writing, we're going to end the day, I hope, with people like exchanging information so that they can network a little bit.
Awesome. So meet some other people in the same path.
Yeah.
Love it. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you again.
Barn Connects is recorded in the Media Arts Studio at Barn on beautiful Bainbridge Island, Washington. Barn is a nonprofit home to 10 maker studios, classes, creative community, and events. You can find this podcast online at bainbridgebarn.org by subscribing to Barn's YouTube channel or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. Learn more on our website, bainbridgebarn.org.